Good morning. My name is Jennifer Harmoning. I'm president of the Burnsville Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us for our Real-Time Solutions webinar this morning. I'm joined by Laura Bordelon from the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, who's going to share with us a legislative wrap-up slash pre-special session. I just want to thank, before we jump in here, I want to thank my partner chambers. We do this in partnership with the Burnsville, Apple Valley, Lakeville, Hastings, and River Heights Chambers of Commerce. And we will be here this morning for this webinar. We'll log off for those of you that are joining us for our next webinar. We'll be back on at 8:45. So I also want to thank our sponsor for this series, Lakeview Bank in Lakeville. So with that, Laura, I'm going to turn it over to you and I will advance your slides as you tell me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning,
Thanks.
everybody. Jennifer and I were chatting before we got started about when we're finally all going to be back in person, which we all are looking forward to, but at the same time, these Zoom meetings have become so efficient for time that it's nice to be able to do both. Thanks for the invitation to join you today. I wish this was a session wrap up, Jennifer. We're still straggling ahead. So with that, let's move through our presentation.
Laura, and as I figure out how to advance the slides, there we go. The other thing I'll say is for you folks, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat and I'll toss them to Laura as they come up or at the end of this, the session here. Thanks.
Perfect. So I think, you know, before we get into what happened, we have to start with how it started. And it's really, when I was putting this presentation together, I really reflected on the crazy and hard year it's been. So before 2021 legislative session started in January, the state was emerging from its worst economic recession in over 70 years. So just from March to April, last March and April, in 2020, our unemployment rate just went through the roof. We had over 613,000 Minnesotans filing for unemployment in that very brief, 4 to 6 week period of time. And businesses and regions of the state were disproportionately impacted. So hospitality, which we all know had to be one of the hardest hit industries in our state, lost half of its jobs in that just 4 to 6 week period. Small business revenue, many of our members, your colleagues, revenue fell by more than 50% in that period of time. And we know why. They were deemed non-essential and they were closed. So they had no way of generating revenue. That was just April and May. And then of course, at the end of May, as we know, we marked this date yesterday with the murder of George Floyd, is civil unrest happened in the Minneapolis and St. Paul urban corridors. There was a lot of destruction. And then that spilled into 7 special sessions. Every month, the legislature came back and extended the governor's emergency powers. All of that led up to a January start of this year with a state budget deficit of $1.3 billion. So a very tough set of circumstances heading into the 2021 session. Okay, Jennifer, next slide, please. And then things changed. By February, when we got the updated budget forecast, the state budget was running a surplus of $1.6 billion. I think that was an indication of how fluid the economy was and how hard it was to judge the impacts of the pandemic. There was $1.8 billion in the budget reserves. And then right before the end of the session, there was a huge infusion of federal stimulus dollars, which you all know. I don't know if you realize how much there was. It was $7.955 billion. We often talk about that $2.6 billion number that goes to state governments, but that was just earmarked for the state. There was other funds directed to other local government entities. So for example, local governments received $2.1 billion. The K-12 education system got its own $1.3 billion, $552 million to public higher education institutions, $528 million to childcare, and then another $337 million to transit systems. So there was a lot of money suddenly flowing into the state. Next slide, Jennifer. So this is how it's going. The 6-month regular session concluded. It was mostly virtual. I think the Senate attempted to have some hybrid meetings, but the House was all virtual. So Zoom's just like this, which is a very funky way of conducting legislative business. You know, you have a very brief period of time to lobby. It's really hard to have any interaction with members. It's hard for them to get their questions in, mostly because of streaming schedules. You had 1.5 hours to plow through an agenda. The budget framework was announced May 17th, which was the final day of the session. And a big part of the reason for that delay in getting a budget framework was simply because the federal money came in and there was no guidance provided. The guidance was finalized. It's actually still somewhat being finalized on May 10th. So much as I hate to give the legislature a reason to not finish its work on time, this was a very valid challenge that they had, is understanding how exactly they could spend those federal funds. So now we're in a situation with multiple deadlines ahead. The legislative budget framework amongst the governor, the majority leader of the Senate, and the House Speaker said by May 28th, which is the end of this week, you have to have your budget spending agreed upon. By June 4th, the policy language needs to be resolved. Now, the reason that's important is this tolling of the governor's emergency powers comes up on June 14th. So most people at the Capitol are speculating that the governor will call a special session for June 14th to coincide when the legislature needs to approve his continuing emergency powers. The other big number or big date is June 30th. That's the end of the state's fiscal year. If there is no budget in place and agreed to, July 1st is the state's shutdown, which by all accounts should be avoided, but that's a very hard stop. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So within the budget framework, the legislative leadership provided 13 different budget targets for the budget conference committees. The governor is given discretion for over $500 million in the federal funds. He's already announced that he's going to use some of that for summer learning programs. They also agreed to set aside $1.2 billion of the federal funds for use in the 2022 special session. And these funds have a lot of flexibility. They simply need to be related to recovery from the pandemic. This $800 million number, my mistake, it's $500 million, is going to fill in the budget reserves. And then the other part of the budget framework is the House, Senate, and governor have final say over budget and policy. And all the lobbyists at the Capitol call this the tribunal. And there's a lot of decision-making that gets consolidated within those three. So there's some process breakdown, frankly, that's been going on for several years now, with just 3 people making some pretty substantial decisions over how the state budget is set up. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So in addition to that budget framework, there's a number of unresolved policy issues, and I'm sure you've heard many of these in the news, but let's just kind of click through what they are. The governor's emergency powers, curtailing those powers or limiting them is still under debate, frankly. Police reforms, there's some tension there still about how much additional work to do. There was some work done last year, but many people feel that more needs to be done. California cars, this is the requirement or the rulemaking by the Pollution Control Agency to tie Minnesota's auto emission standards to the state of California. That is linked with an environment bill where state park funding, different environmental spending and environmental regulations are all tangled up in this one big bill. Workplace mandates, there are still some issues outstanding, which I'll get to in a little bit. There are a number of different proposals transitioning from to cleaner energy that are still in the mix, and recreational marijuana, although the Senate has said it's unlikely they will pass something. Sometimes these issues find a way of getting passed through a deal on other matters. So that is still in the mix. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So for the chamber, and many of you who've been involved with our work this session will recognize these priorities, but I just wanted to talk about them a little bit and talk about our progress on them. So for us, it has been all about economic recovery this session. That is number one priority, and frankly, it should have been the number one priority for the legislature. When we talk about economic recovery, we talk about stabilizing businesses and accelerating economic growth. So many of our members are still struggling, either because consumer confidence isn't back. We've just now gotten past the mask mandate in some parts of the state, not all. There's a lot of fear about coming back, but there's a lot of desire for the businesses to welcome customers back into their buildings at full capacity. So for specific priorities, number one on our list was the Paycheck Protection Program loan forgiveness tax treatment. So the federal government said that they will forgive these loans, but Minnesota, always difficult on federal conformity, really dragged their feet until the last possible moment, frustratingly, to pass tax forgiveness of these loans. You know, it's tough when we look around and we see all of the surrounding states having done this, and we hear so much from communities that are next to Wisconsin or Iowa or North or South Dakota, how challenging this is for businesses on our side of the border to not have that similar advantage of knowing that these loans wouldn't be taxed. We also very strongly argued to the legislature that they shouldn't increase taxes or increase costs. They should be allowed, especially under these really tough circumstances, to dictate their own employee benefits. A lot of employees took PTO, took advantage of the federal allowance for paid leave. It was a really tough workers environment with COVID. We also wanted to make sure we retain quality, affordable healthcare, and that if we make any moves on energy environment, that we take into account the costs. A lot of businesses use some of the federal funds to pay utility bills. It was a tough time if you're not making any revenue to be able to cover your energy costs. We certainly hear of examples of people falling far behind on some of their utility bills, so we didn't want to pile on and make it harder for people to afford their electricity. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So this is a quick update on where things stand on our priorities. I want to thank all of you who contacted your legislators on making sure that PPP was not taxable in Minnesota. We got that done. That was part of the announcement for end of session. We're thrilled to have that done. A lot of these businesses didn't set aside money to pay a tax on a forgivable loan. So that was a big deal. And similarly on unemployment insurance benefits, those aren't taxed as well. That was kind of a matched pairing, which is important. Thank you, Tony, you're right. It needs to be signed into law. It's agreed to, you're right. So the other piece for us is no new workplace mandates. We've seen some really far-reaching proposals on paid leave. If you combine all of the House proposals from the paid family and medical leave to emergency sick and safe time, emergency sick and safe time for workers who were deemed essential. If you total all of those up, it was over 30 weeks of paid leave. There's still a question about some of the unemployment insurance expansions. Some of the proposals we've seen are for 16 and 17-year-olds to be eligible for UI. Some of the proposals are for seniors to be eligible for UI. There's also some commonality between House and Senate considerations for pregnancy and lactation accommodations, making breaks for lactation paid. Also in kind of updating some of the certain work requirements for women workers who are pregnant. There's also a proposal for a requirement for apprenticeship work and certification for working at some of the high hazard facilities. These are specific to refineries, both Marathon and Flint Hills. There's a push by some of the union groups to make sure that workers go through their apprenticeship programs. And then there was a proposal from the Department of Economic Development to make changes to the workforce development program. This is a payroll tax employers submit. Some of their proposals we think need some more work. We'd like to have a lot more employer input into some of those changes. So but that's still up in the air. That might be debated and passed yet during the special session. Next slide, please. So this is where we stand in healthcare. I will tell you, one of the question marks we still have is for the status of reinsurance. There was an agreement in this global agreement for reinsurance not to be continued beyond a 5th year. We can speculate on why that happened. There's some interaction between the Affordable Care Act and the American Rescue Plan, providing for some additional premium subsidy as well as capping copays. We're thinking, although we haven't been able to confirm this, that might be part of the reason that reinsurance wasn't extended. Obviously, we're concerned about rates in the individual market and want to make sure those don't spike up without the reinsurance as a backup. Public option, there was a study proposed in the House that is still on the table as far as we know, and will probably be worked out in the Health and Human Services Conference Committee. It's actually a working group now. And then one of our priorities for the year is having a mandate review assessment done. When the legislature proposes new mandates, we want to make sure those are considered from a cost-benefit analysis and not just automatically passed. Minnesota has one of the longest lists of mandates in the country. We have over 60 different mandates, and those fall squarely on individuals in the fully insured market. Okay, next slide, please, Jennifer. Energy and environment has been a very hot topic this year. Some of the proposals we've seen, particularly, mostly on the House side, is some very far-reaching ideas. Some of them are from Governor Walz, and some of them are from the House. So one of the proposals is for 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040, a net zero greenhouse gas emissions requirement by 2050. So that would be transportation, buildings, energy generation. And then there's a whole suite of different proposals for electric vehicle rebates. There's a proposal called Clean Energy First, where clean energy would be considered first by utilities when replacing generation capacity. Community solar gardens, Minnesota has a particularly expensive version of how utilities buy solar from community solar gardens. And then one of the bills that passed is the Eco-SIP bill and Renewable Natural Gas bill. This is a combination of proposals that changes how the Conservation Improvement Program works. It has some incentives for changing from fossil fuels to clean energy. It also provides some incentives for consumers to switch over to cleaner utilities or cleaner energy sources, such as heat pumps, electric-based options versus fossil fuel or natural gas-based options. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So also, there's a couple of kind of more on the environmental and less energy side. As I mentioned, the clean cars emission standards still very much in the mix, still being hotly debated. This is a priority for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and for the House. The Senate is less interested in requiring auto dealers to have more electric vehicles on their lots. For us, the issue here is really kind of outsourcing, for lack of a better word, Minnesota's environmental regulatory process to another state. It's not so much about clean cars for the Minnesota Chamber. It's more about having a different state determining what our air emissions should be. It just makes no sense to us. There's a number of different suggestions for how the PCA should increase some of its regulatory authority and enforcement. We already have a very, very robust and in some ways duplicative environmental review and permitting process. So we want to make sure that doesn't get more cumbersome for businesses. Just a note, we do support really strong and fair environmental regulations, but we have a lot of different layers of regulations in Minnesota, both at the local level, state level, and then of course the federal level. And then there's some proposals on water quality fees that we think are reasonable and important, but we just want to make sure we don't make our already complex permitting system that much more complex. Next slide, please, Jennifer. So what's next? As I mentioned, as you can see, there's a lot of issues left on the table, and many of them are very thorny and very complicated. One of the concerns for us is there's really a lack of process going on. I think the only committee that's really it's not really a committee. These are now called working groups because we're in a special session, but the only one that's meeting regularly, that's posted for legislators, lobbyists to track, is the Health and Human Services Committee. There are 13 other groups, right, resolving these budget questions. And it's really primarily happening behind closed doors, which is frankly a terrible process for the state. This is likely a $52 billion budget, and not being able to see some of the debate or decision makings or objections or arguments for or against some of these provisions is very challenging and probably not ideal, to say the least. The hard stop for the legislature, as we mentioned, is June 30th. They have to be done on that date or we get into a state budget shutdown. There's also the very real likelihood that a lot of these more complex policy issues will just get set aside for the next session. That's not uncommon in a budget setting year, and it's probably a good idea. If they're hard to resolve, they probably need more debate and persuasion. So I know there's a lot of different stakeholders anxious to get some of these policy issues moved ahead. It's in part a function of a divided government. We are the only one in the country with a divided government. So having more debate and resolving these issues may not be the worst thing, even though there's a lot of pressure to get a lot of things done. And the last, consideration is politics. We do have a split legislature. It makes getting some of these budgets resolved that much harder. There was an article recently that talked about the fact that I think we've had 7 special sessions for the past 10 budget cycles. It's very, very tough to get this work done, in part because of the very intense grassroots lobbying that we all do, but also, partisanship. We are a more divided state. We are a more polarized pair of parties, and it really makes getting some of this work done that much more challenging. The last comment I would make about politics is, the Governor Walz is up for re-election next year. And there's a number of folks who have raised their hand and said they're interested in challenging him from the Senate. There's some former senators, there's some other elected officials who have expressed an interest in running. So it feels like we're always operating under the backdrop of politics. It is a political process, and it's just kind of a reality for us as we try to wrap up a budget. So with that, I think we have our last slide, and we are ready for questions if there are any, Jennifer.
Great, thank you, Laura. And I do encourage you, I keep checking the chat and I haven't seen questions come up from the audience yet, but I just wanted to circle back. I do feel like the Clean Cars initiative tends to, I don't know, how would I say, fly under the radar. And it's been an interesting one. Our chamber has taken a position on it, and the position is primarily this needs to go through a more transparent process. That obviously we have a lot of car dealerships in Burnsville, and anytime a government agency goes into a deeper dive on how they do their business, it becomes problematic. And so, but it seems like this is being used as a bargaining chip. I mean, is there anything else you can share with our audience today about, I mean, we can't take a deep dive into it, but this is rulemaking it's not actually in front of the legislature as a policy. It's going through rulemaking, which means the administrative agency is expanding their authority here and proposing to do this. What role does the legislature have in saying whether they can or can't do that?
That's exactly the fight. You've articulated it really clearly. That's exactly the question. So, there's a lot of technical issues that the legislature has said to state agencies, you can wrestle with this, go through your public comment period. They're often lengthy and they're often technical. But with giving this degree of regulatory authority through rulemaking is what the legislature is objecting to. And I think it's a reasonable objection because it has real economic impacts. It affects a lot of people. It affects daily lives in many instances. It affects real businesses, the car dealerships. So I think it's a fair question to push on isn't this more of a legislative debate And shouldn't we decide as elected representatives versus having a state agency make this determination? I understand that. I think that's a very reasonable position for them to take. The challenge for us, and I remember the angel investor tax credit, I don't know if you remember that from several years ago, is you get into these, kind of cage matches about who should, how to have these items in bills or not. I think it would be okay if they set this issue aside and said, we're going to fight on this issue as a standalone and not tie up all the state park funding and all the other environmental issues that we have. But then you lose leverage, and the process is kind of built around leverage and pressure. So I think California CARS is a really fair question to be debated legislatively. I think it's the right thing to do.
We might have to have you back and have an open discussion on omnibus bills versus standalones, because that came up with our legislators on Monday and talking about the pros and cons of omnibus bills. But we have a couple questions in the chat, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole this morning. One question we have in the Q&A is, will there be any focus on workforce development? You and I were talking about that before we started this morning. It says labor and our ability to hire candidates of any level of qualification has simply become impossible.
I very much appreciate that point. I hear this everywhere. Is, for some of the larger businesses, they can raise their hourly wage and provide a signing bonus. There's a lot of small businesses amongst our membership. They simply can't afford to do it. I mean, they're still just getting back on their feet. And when they can't find enough people to come in and work, that makes it that much harder. A lot of people have been debating if the plus-ups, that's what we call them, on unemployment are really disincentivizing work. I think that is a question. Representative Dave Baker had a really interesting notion of providing a bonus for people to come back to work that basically would use some of the money that you would otherwise be getting through unemployment, except it would incentivize coming back. I don't know how much traction that's going to get. It's a good thought. It's creative. Some other states have done it. But it's a very tough situation. And I think we're, this demographic wave we've been watching come at us has clearly arrived. And we might be in a longer term workforce shortage in Minnesota. I hate to say it, but we might be at that point where everybody who's willing to work is working. I frankly am a little reluctant to say that, but it might not just be related to COVID. We might be at our kind of maximum workforce.
Right. And we were in a tough spot pre-COVID, and now we're just,
right.
But I think I appreciate the work you guys are doing on the reformatting of the workforce funding and how they're looking at doing things, and appreciate having that voice of business in there. We're almost at time, but there's a couple questions, and I just want to, here's a quick question for you. Are there many new healthcare mandates?
Well, I want to say no, but Robert, these bills are not, it's not clear what's being debated to us. So there might be some more mandates in the mix. I sure hope not. We are overboard already in Minnesota on this. And this kind of lack of transparency we're struggling with is what's actually being traded, what's being debated behind closed doors. I don't know. I don't think so, but I don't have a definitive answer on that. I'm sorry.
All right, two more quick, we'll try to wrap it up here. Beyond the mandates already mentioned, a couple of other key issues for us include affordable housing and public transportation. Any anticipated focus on these topics?
So there is some money set aside in the federal dollars for housing. Transportation, Kelly, has really been sidelined. I think anticipation of this big infrastructure bill, other than the money that was provided for transit, I think the expectation is there will be substantial funding coming down from the federal government through this infrastructure bill. So they kind of paused some of the transportation spending. And Representative Jurgens, I put a note in the chat correcting myself. You're right. Both of those bills haven't passed, but they've been agreed to. So hopefully they will be passed in special session. Thank you for that correction. I really appreciate it.
Great. And then the other question here from Ed is, now that things are opening up again almost fully, can the governor still extend his emergency powers?
Oh, Ed, yes. As far as we know, there hasn't been any suggestions on curtailing the governor's emergency powers. I hope that is part of what's discussed at the leadership level in special session, but I have not heard anything definitive about changing his emergency powers. Publicly, he still makes the case, I need emergency powers for, I think, SNAP benefits. There's some vaccine considerations, and there's one other item that's not coming to mind that he's mentioned that he needs continued emergency powers for. The legislature could allow him to have that. They could pass a bill saying the governor can have emergency powers that relates to the following. I'm kind of surprised they haven't discussed that. Maybe they have, but I don't know beyond those things that he's publicly mentioned what he may need continued emergency powers under COVID for. So we'll see.
Well, Laura, thank you for joining us. I know, as you said, the best is yet to come. Here we go into yet another special session. Everybody is giving us indications that they don't plan on government shutdown. So we're hoping it's not coming to that we'll actually get this taken care of here in June. But we look forward to further conversations as we actually wrap up the session. So we'll see where we're at when that happens. But thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you to Lakeview Bank, our series sponsor, and to my partner chambers. So this is brought to you by the Burnsville, Apple Valley, Lakeville, Hastings, and River Heights Chamber of Commerce. This program is being recorded and will be posted on all the partner chamber websites. So feel free to share that. And we will be logging off here. For those of you that are joining us, we'll be back at 8:45 for our, with our attorney from Dougherty Melinda, talking about employer rights and responsibilities related to the vaccines. And you can still register for that if you haven't to get your Zoom link. So thank you, Laura. Have a great day, and we'll see you again real soon.